So I'm going to jump straight in. Some of what I say may be a bit shocking. So this is officially, I'm going to try to make it not too triggering. But to talk about the reality of what we face right now and the work needed to do it, um, requires me to actually talk about the difference between what you see on your screen, is what Ryan spoke about. So Ryan chatted with you guys about um, the 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 impacts of climate change, some of those. And I want to say to you that there's a difference between the impacts of climate change, some of which you see on your screen, like here, like he spoke about all these things. I'm not going to talk about that. There's a difference between all of this and the impacts of climate change policies. Because right now, the issue is not really science. Like the core of the negotiations is not is this happening? How much is it happening? Are the models correct? Yeah, there are some people at the fringes that are having fierce debates, but it's at the fringes. The debate at the core is who's going to pay for this stuff? Who's going to pay for the mess? It's a political issue. It's an economic issue. And because of that, I want you in your mind to separate the impacts of climate change itself from the impacts of climate change policies. As governments try their best to wrap their minds around what they could do and should be doing and are doing. All right. I'm going to move fairly quickly, and I'm going to ask, excuse me, I'm going to ask everyone to please put as many questions in the chat as you want. This is a topic that I care very deeply about, and I'm just going to pretty much be real with you all. And so feel free to dump all the questions in chat, and we try to answer as many of them as possible afterwards. So we're going to talk about the politics of climate change. And again, without getting too deep into what politics is, politics at its core tries to address the concerns of a number of stakeholders in political science, you call them constituencies or publics, you know. But here's what you need to know. Here's the key thing here. Measures that we put in place to address climate change could actually impact your life in very real ways. I ask students most of the times in most of my classes, I say, so how many of you all think that climate change is urgent and that we need to do something about it today? Most of them say, yes, you need to do something. I said, how many of you all think we need to take drastic action and, you know, curtail fossil fuel production? Most of them say yes. I said, so how many of you all would support Trinidad and Tobago curtailing its production of fossil fuels by at least 50%? Again, most people would say yes. I say, how many of you would still support those measures if it meant that your parents would get fired if they were working there? Or even if they were working for a contractor that was hired by a company that was producing oil and gas in Trinidad. And then the hands stop going up. When it hits home, when it hits you, then people start asking themselves, okay, so what's going on? And some of the impacts on people are going to be unavoidable. Some of the impacts on people are going to be due to poor policy design. And one of my really favorite examples of poor policy design is actually a British policy. If you ever travel from London back to the Caribbean, look at you know how sometimes they give you the details of all of the taxes that you pay. Look, you see one that says air passenger duty on it. And at first it was introduced as an environmental levy, you know, a flat tax on all passengers, right? Just depending on you're paying more if you're traveling business than if you're in economy. But in 2009, by the way, it was kind of freaky when I was asking my students how old they were in 2009. I was just like, I feel much older now. But in 2009, the British government decided to disaggregate the charge, as in to put them into these bands, whereby the further you were traveling away from the UK, the more you pay. And the justification, obviously, is that the more you emit by traveling is the more you should pay. So they came up with these bans. And these are not small numbers. If you have a family of 4, for example, traveling in 2000 10 2011, you have a family of four, you have to pay $280. If you're traveling over 6,000 miles away, you have to pay $280. Multiply by four. That's a lot of money. I mean, it was designed to be a disincentive. So many families just chose to go to Greece or Portugal instead because that $280 charge was to come to the Caribbean. And obviously, most of our Caribbean governments dispatched their ambassadors to London to complain. And we complained bitterly. Why? Hotels started laying off people. Less people started coming. Because this policy was doing what it was designed to do. So they said it was creating an incentive for people to take their holidays in Europe rather than taking these carbon intensive flights over to the Caribbean and to the Pacific as well. There was a problem, however. There was a problem. The way that they did it, let me go back. The way that they did it is that they did it based on the capital cities. So that it would be Washington to Port of Spain. Sorry, it'd be London to Washington or London to Port of Spain or London to Bridgetown. But that created an unusual problem that no one saw coming. All of a sudden, the number of people starting to go to Hawaii shot up. The number of people starting to go to Tahiti increased. And people were wondering why. Well, and it's because they was attracting a cheaper tariff. And I mean, the best way to illustrate this is actually to show you a map. Maybe that will help it to kind of like stay in your memory, because I thought this was one of the most fascinating examples of poor policy design that I've seen in a long, long, long time. And so I'm just going to show you exactly what happened, right? And what happened was this. They decided to use capital cities, and what you're seeing is a map of essentially the world. And this is London. And so if somebody wanted to travel from London to the Caribbean, they would pay, see the Caribbean is down here. Of course, that's a lot of miles. So you pay like 2,000. You pay a lot. And Washington is actually closer to London. But where's Hawaii? Hawaii's all the way over here. And so we were trying to figure out what is this going on? Why is it so cheap? And then we figured out, what's the capital of Hawaii? It's not Honolulu. The capital of Hawaii is Washington, D.C. And the capital of Tahiti is Paris. And so they designed a policy that literally incentivized people to take these humongously long flights to Hawaii and long flights to French Polynesia because of, well, some persons would say colonialism. Overseas territories is a more diplomatic term for it. But countries that are literally territories of a larger country. And because they just said, when the Caribbean government confronted the British government and said, what are you doing? This isn't serving the planet any purpose. They said two things. They said, number one, it's for administrative ease. They said they couldn't calculate the distance to every single airport in the world. Number one, the British government has to be one of the wealthiest on the planet. So I call garbage on that. Number two, the money from these taxes were not going towards environmental causes. They were going into the general coffers of the British, of Her Majesty's Treasury. And so the Caribbean government started to make noise. And rightfully so, but it was this weird thing where we were saying, you have to reform this. And the British government's initial response was, don't you want us to do something about climate change? But yes, we do. But as Ryan successfully put in the chat, or correctly put in the chat rather, that's what you call a perverse incentive. You are literally incentivizing some destinations, which happen to be your destination, those like destinations in of your allies, we can say, like destinations in Hawaii and in Tahiti, etc. You're incentivizing specific destinations and then penalizing everybody else, including countries like Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, you name it. So there was a lot of pressure and there was a lot of animated debate until 2015. Now, bear in mind, it took them how long? 6 years to change this. And let me just be very real about this. In that 6 years, hundreds of people went home. Let me just be very clear. There's a difference between the impacts of climate change and the impacts of climate change policies. Yes, you want to do something about it. What are those things that we should be doing? And how do we design those interventions? So that's equally as important. That's what I spend my days doing. That's what I spend my time thinking about. And that's what we talk about in the classes in which I teach. I think it's critical that we get this right. Because if we don't, we're going to jeopardize people's livelihoods for absolutely no reason. Because in the case of the APD, of this policy, what ended up happening was that we had a policy that was damaging to the environment and damaging to persons' lives. Because what we did is we incentivized humongously long flights to Hawaii, which was also emitting heat into the environment. I'm going to go much more quickly. Eventually, the UK Chancellor said that the APD was hitting exports and it puts off tourists, creates a great sense of injustice among Caribbean and South Asian communities. No kidding. What's interesting from this rationale is he made this speech about the injustice among Caribbean and South Asian communities in Britain. Did not necessarily address the Caribbean and South Asian communities and Pacific communities in the Caribbean. But anyway, we don't have heaps of time, so I'm going to keep it going. They changed the policy, they simplified the policy instrument, and as they put it in their own words, they took the L, as if they accepted a loss of about 437 million US per year, which is what they would have, which was the simplification cost them. By the way, this is why it took them 6 years to change it, because that's a lot of money. And it didn't really matter if people were going home. Those people going home in the Caribbean are not their voters. And that is the stark reality of it. If somebody loses their job in a Caribbean island, that's tough. But they're not voting for a British politician. The British politician is concerned about their constituencies. Why is that important? Because it's important for you to keep in your mind that all of these negotiations that you see happening on a global scale about environmental agreements, about climate action, you need to keep in your mind that environmental agreements, as Ryan kind of alluded to, are actually not first and foremost about protecting the environment. They actually are first and foremost about protecting people. Let me be very clear about this. The environment doesn't vote. The environment can't cost anybody an election. And as Ryan kind of said, the environment over time will be okay. Even if we wipe out ecosystems in the short term. Let me be very, very, very clear about this. The nature of our system right now is that is what we call anthropocentric, which means human-centered. What that means in practice is that if we do something that causes the extinction of an entire species, no one will care until and unless it begins to affect humans. So we could talk until you're blue in the face about how climate change is affecting, the species of birds and, the species of bees. You need to then tie that into, if we don't do something about these bees, it's going to affect the agriculture because those bees are pollinators to your crops. And then it's going to affect your food security. But then food prices are going to go up and people are going to vote you out of government because food prices went up. All of a sudden, you have somebody's attention. I am not saying this by guess. I'm saying this from lived experience. It really does not matter when we have these losses that people talk about, oh my gosh, all these species that when you tie it into human impacts, which is what Ryan was kind of relating to earlier, that's when it really catches the attention, not just of politicians, but of you, of the media. So this I really want to drive this point home because it is the impacts on people that drive climate change policies, which is kind of an unfortunate reality that the impact on the environment is not really driving the policies. It's really first and foremost the impact on people. And it's because we care about people that we try to fix the environment. That also impacts how we try to fix the environment. We try to fix the environment in the service of people. That's a very different outcome than if you were trying to change the environment for the service of the environment. Feel free to ask me questions after, but I do not want to take up too much of your time. I'm just going to mention agriculture briefly, because it's also small and developing states traditionally have been dependent on these two sectors, one services, one goods, so tourism and agriculture, right? And I have stories upon stories upon stories that I can share of what these things actually mean in practice. I'm happy to share afterwards, but I do not want to keep you on any longer than I need to. So I'm just going to share about agriculture and then I'll stop speaking. Ardeen, if you don't mind, I mean the actual Ardeen, not the many other Ardeens in the chat. Just tell me in the chat how much more time I have, and so I can keep myself on time. Agriculture. We've heard for quite a bit that climate change itself is going to impact agricultural production, and that is true. But it's not just that; it's also going to impact policies that impact agriculture. So when governments begin to say, "Oh, we're going to begin to measure food miles," we're going to say that we need to incentivize local agricultural production, you need to think to yourself, "Oh, besides having to deal with sea level rise and increased salinity in soils and our farmers in agriculture, our farmers in around West struggling with the floods almost every year. Besides all that, besides the increase in pests, besides all of that, what's going to happen to our chocolates and our bananas, for example?" These are questions that we need to figure out quick as we try to um, really wrap our head around the policies that we put in place. I think it's critical because our current farming model is one where we try to incentivize export-driven agriculture in order to earn foreign exchange. But what many climate scientists are saying, and what climate policymakers are also going to say is we need to disincentivize persons from buying foreign goods that have to, again, take lots of emissions to come across the sea so that we can eat it here. Eventually, even persons are going to begin to say, do I need a banana from the Caribbean with my breakfast, or can I just have a raspberry from York or from Sussex? People are beginning to rethink these equations, and that now has an added impact or a knock-on effect on our farmers and the producers of food in the Caribbean, on agriculture in the Caribbean. That's really, really important. Again, these are not necessarily science questions unless you're asking yourself, okay, what is the exact amount of emissions that we generate by having to export these things? And probably having to buy carbon offsets and that kind of stuff to account for your carbon impact. There might be some science there, but the crux of it is, what are the policies that these governments are going to pass and how is it going to impact our produce? That's already begun. If you have more questions about that, feel free to ask me. The EU has just rolled out a policy on this very question. It's called a cross-border adjustment mechanism, and it literally is targeting quantities that have a large embodied energy, or put us in more simpler terms, commodities that use lots of oil and gas in their production. They're targeting those because they're squeezing their own people, and they don't want people going outside the EU to produce these things with less stringent production. So what the EU started to say, everybody, once you want to import into the EU, you put in more policies in place. So a lot of these questions are not going to be science-based questions. They're going to be, well, they're going to be political questions. And it's going to get a little worse. The reason why I say that is because it's also internally. So governments internally now need to think about, okay, well, how are we supposed to transition from agriculture, our normal agricultural practices, to climate smart agriculture? How do we support our farmers? Or how do we, in some politicians say, how do we force them to change? You know, do you make sure that, do you remove all subsidies on water, on diesel? And so farmers have to use more efficient technologies. And then you maybe subsidize the efficient technologies. How do you go about doing this? These are the questions that many governments around the world are now asking themselves. And of course, what we're trying to encourage is a more consultative approach, where we sit down with the communities, with our publics, with our different peoples in our communities, and say, how is this impacting you? What are the changes that we need to make so that we can all make these adjustments? Because as Ryan also said towards the end of his talk, this is not impacting everyone in the same way. The effects of climate itself, the effects of climate change itself, the climate change impacts are not impacting everyone the same way. The flooding is not impacting everybody the same way. If you're in a poor community, if you're in an informal settlement, i.e. squatting, you're not going to be impacted the same way as somebody who is living in a high-income community. It's just not going to happen in the same way. You're not going to feel it in the same way. In that same vein, how you impacted by government policies meant to address these things is also not going to impact you in the same way. So if the government says, no more subsidy on water, no more subsidy on diesel, no more subsidy on electricity, which, by the way, are things that I've actually said that we need to do within a certain framework. That's not going to affect everybody in the same way. So when I say to the government, we need to remove the subsidy on electricity almost entirely, but we need to protect those that need social protection. We need to ensure that low-income communities are still protected and have access to energy. So those are the kind of conversations that we need to have. And those are the things you need to think through. So if we increase the price of electricity, we don't necessarily take off the lights in the poorest community. Right? There is one more thing that I'm going to put out into this conversation that I also had on Instagram earlier in the year, because I have, I think, 1 more minute. I'm going to use my 1 more minute to I don't think this should be controversial, but it certainly is thought-provoking. And let me just go really, really quickly towards the end. Last slide. This slide. This is how I want to leave you in terms of food for thought. There's a problem called the tragedy of the comments, which is something that I spoke about earlier this year on social media. And tragedy of the comments says that if there's one resource and we all using it, even if the resource will be depleted, no one will stop using that resource. Even if they know it's going to be depleted, no one is going to stop using the resource if they know other people are going to keep using it and benefit. All parties have to come together and say, listen, we're going to stop this in order to preserve the resource. Even if they know that them still using it will help it to run out and it will rob them of a future of access to that resource, they will still keep using it rather than sit down, stop using it, and then watch somebody else be able to benefit. That's quite the tragedy of the commons. That's what happened with slavery. So no one wanted to say no to free labor. And well, how did we end up there? Well, Europeans found themselves in the Caribbean and they wanted commercial agriculture. They met subsistence agriculture here, they wanted commercial agriculture and commercial export-oriented agriculture. So they enslaved indigenous populations. They died, over 90% of them died. So they imported slaves from Africa. Remember, no one was brave enough to say, we need to stop this or else we're going to deplete the resource. No, again, no one wanted to say no to free labor when it came to African slaves. We don't want it to stay because if any one government, if Britain said we're going to stop doing this, then Spain would continue, France would continue, and the British government was concerned that their economies would take off and leave the British economy behind. So no one wanted to stop until machines became more efficient than people because machines don't revolt and machines don't need 3 square meals a day. They just need to be fed with, at that time, with coal, which led to climate change. So that transition from energy supply, they replaced human labor, which is the slaves, with machines fed by coal, which led to climate change. And now climate change is forcing us towards having to transition to sustainable products, sustainable energy, which is now driving us to finding minerals to power those sustainable technologies, which incidentally and really strangely, in some ways, is forcing or is creating conditions whereby we now have a lot of illegal mines. A lot. There's a lithium triangle in Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, and there's lots of illegal mines powered by a lot of women, actually, and children. Same thing happens in Congo and some African states as well. With cobalt and nickel, some of the minerals that we need to power this more sustainable future that we're driving towards is some of the minerals are coming from some horrendous conditions. And so we got to this point because we found a way out of using slaves for labor. And we're back at a point where we have some modern day slavery because of this. And even beyond that, we now have deep sea mining, which is another issue altogether. I don't want to modern issues too much. But my food for thought for you as I leave is this. Knowing that it was probably morally wrong to sell people for profit, for the sake of profit, did not stop people from engaging and enslaving millions of Africans. Feeding the moral weight of it did not stop slavery. It didn't stop them from selling. It didn't stop people from selling people. Do you think it's going to stop? Do you think climate change and knowing what's going to happen with climate change, do you think it's going to be enough to stop people from selling a chemical like oil and gas? The reason why I have this diagram on the screen is to get you to pull out and see that there is also, aside from the nitty-gritty policies that I mentioned earlier, there is also a need for deep systemic change. And it's that change that I'm hoping to inspire here this evening. God bless you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form.